In 1967, the Liberal government under the leadership of Lester B. Pearson put forth the Omnibus Bill. This is a bill that proposed to revise abortion laws, legalize lotteries, and restrict gun ownership. But the section that got the most publicity was the section that decriminalized homosexual acts performed in private. The Omnibus Bill was designed to update the Canadian Criminal Code so that it was more in line with 1960s contemporary society. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General at the time, famously defended the Omnibus Bill by stating, "There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. What's done in private between adults doesn't concern the criminal code." And yet, right up until the 1990s, 2S LGBTQI+ Canadian citizens experienced a purge when it came to jobs in the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, and the Federal Public Service. Thousands of careers were ruined, and the harassment sustained by the victims of the purge created lifelong emotional and psychological damage. Right now, at the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, there is an exhibit that deals with Canada's LGBT purge called Love in a Dangerous Time. This exhibit explores this dark past of our nation's history, a history that is well documented, but unfortunately not very well known. Aside from government policy and past injustice, Love in a Dangerous Time is about courage and perseverance. It's about loss and triumph. Most importantly, it is about individuals, those who suffered discrimination and who stood up against powerful and pervasive biases. One highlight of the exhibit is The Regulation of Desire, a remarkable 10-minute short film written and directed by Winnipeg filmmaker Noam Gonick. The film explores various aspects of the purge through contemporary dance, with all performers brought to life by members of the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. And joining me here in the Classic 107 studio to talk about his film, The Regulation of Desire, and the exhibit Love in a Dangerous Time at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, I am joined by filmmaker Noam Gonick. Hi, Noam. Nice to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to start out by asking about the LGBT purge. Can you talk about some of the abuses people suffered as a result of that?
Well, I think your intro did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of outlining it. But what specifically happened? Well, people were turfed out of jobs. People who had careers, that they intended on, doing for their entire lives were, summarily dismissed. So the purge really looks a lot at employment, and it is now thought of as the largest workplace employment discrimination case in Canadian history. So it's got a very legal aspect, but then there's also a very personal and emotional aspect to the purge, because even for those who weren't, say, government employees or members of the military, but for people who were just in the general Canadian population, there was still the shadow of the purge all around them, and it was living in kind of a noir cloak and dagger kind of world.
Mm-hmm. And there was a lawsuit that was filed against the Canadian government. It was advocated for by Michelle Douglas, who was expelled from the military, and Todd Ross, who lost his job in the Navy. Can you talk about that lawsuit a bit?
Yeah, well, Michelle, who is actually featured in the ballet, and how cool to have the RWB dancing part of your life story in a ballet. I mean, that's amazing. I told Michelle, you're in pretty good company in terms of characters that have been danced by prima ballerinas. But she actually was very young. She was just out of high school or college, and she, she thought that she was in a career that she was cut out for, and she really loved serving. And then all of a sudden, the carpet got pulled up from underneath her. She was interrogated, asked to name names. Michelle decided, and this is what's unusual about her, she's not going to take this lying down. She's going to fight back. So I guess they purged the wrong person. And she met a parliamentarian, Sven Robinson, and he encouraged her, because at the time that she was purged, we had we had more legal avenues. There was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. And so what the military was doing in this government policy was no longer technically allowed. It's just that no one had challenged it by that point. So Michelle took on the case, and all these years later, she's still working to make the military a safer place for us LGBT people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was on the Government of Canada's website. They have the LGBT Purge class action final settlement agreement. For our listeners, there were 719 claimants, 629 were from the military, 78 were public servants, and 12 were RCMP officers. The settlement provided $145 million. $110 million went to individual compensation, including those who suffer from the purge, $15 million for legal fees, $5 million for external administration, and then there was another $15 million for recognition and memorialization exhibits and monuments administered by the LGBT Purge Fund. Is Love in a Dangerous Time part of that $15 million that was set aside?
Yeah, the exhibit was, and so is the monument that's also being done by Winnipeg artists Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan. That's going to be in Ottawa. And what I was told was that a lot of those funds came from people who were purged, but then passed away before and didn't leave heirs. So, those funds were then used for this public education purpose.
Mm-hmm. So I want to turn to your film, The Regulation of Desire. First, can you talk about where the title comes from?
Yeah, I studied with a great sociologist in film school named Gary Kinsman, and he wrote a book called The Regulation of Desire, and it's now in its third printing. It's published by Concordia University Press, and it was really the first book that looked at this Canadian governmental purge and suppression of queer people. And since then, he's gone on to write another book, co-write it with Patricia Gentile, and it's called Canada's War on Queer. So he's really one of the primary academics who has studied this from a historical, sociological perspective. Mm-hmm. And he was a great teacher. And in fact, that course really, opened my mind in so many ways. I was a young film student, but sometimes you take these electives and they end up having way more of an influence on you. And I would say this was the one. So, and he went on to teach in Sudbury for many, many years, and he's still very active, extremely political. He has his own blog, and just a great, great thinker and a huge influence.
Mm-hmm. The film is described as a ballet in 7 movements. Are there 7 different choreographed segments? And if so, can you talk about some of the stories and themes that you wanted to touch on in the film?
Yeah, there are definitely 7. And then the movements are then kind of padded with this interstitial page turner who is a pole dancer, Michael Walker, who's not part of the ballet, but is kind of the glue that holds the whole piece together. Just reminding us of this kind of burlesque, kind of go-go boy dance roots of the queer story. But the chapters themselves cover some very, very heavy moments from the exhibit. So you have Ambassador John Watkins, who was a Canadian ambassador, retired. He had served in Moscow, but was dragged into interrogation and died while 2 RCMP officers were interrogating him in a motel. So that was one of the chapters. Of course, Michelle's story is told in various guises. There's kind of her fight back at the end when she challenges and wins and becomes, accepted and welcomed into the military ranks and whatnot. But then there's her romance, and it's a beautiful movement. It's looking at lesbian softball, which all is kind of a bit of a stereotype, but some of them are so true. And it's danced by Elizabeth Lamont, who plays Michelle in all the different movements that she's in. And then there's also Katie Bonnell, who's sort of the love interest. And so there's this beautiful kind of sequence that then gets interrupted at the end by Stefan Azulay, who plays this kind of inspector character that sort of breaks up the party on quite a few of the movements. There's also one called Noche Hostem, which is Latin for Know Thine Enemy, and it's all about cruising at night. And Stefan Azulay, interrupts the sort of night forest cruising ballet that happens as well. So, and some of it is quite militaristic. I was inspired by Chinese, Peking Cultural Revolution type opera, and with dancers in uniform and rifles in sort of precise military ballet. So I think that's almost all the movements. There's one that really looks specifically at civil servants, and it's called Silly Service. And yeah, there's we do try to have some pleasure in it. I think that it was important to have romance, beauty, sensuality, a bit of humor, as well as all the sort of torturous, horrible stuff that goes down in a purge story as well.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, you mentioned it earlier, these are premier dancers in the Royal Winnipeg Ballet Company. You've got Elizabeth Lamont and Stephen Azoulay. They're principal dancers with the company, amongst others. How did that relationship with the RWB come about?
Well, we approached them, and Tara Birtwistle, who is a very high up artistic director there at the time, and she actually helped and casted, and she sort of recommended these dancers and selected them because she felt that they were the ones that would be the best at bridging dance and cinema and the camera. And she ought to know because she was the star of Dracula, directed by Guy Maddin, that ballet film. And that's actually where I first met her. So, that's how it came about. Really, we were very welcomed, and I think the administration and the artistic leadership at the ballet said yes and wanted these dancers to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm. And judging by the Instagram, the costumes are fantastic. Do you have access to the costume department at the RWB as well?
Yeah, we actually, and it's an incredible resource, the vault, the archive of costumes that goes back to the 1960s. And you climb up a ladder and go all the way up to the rafters, and you can find old Nutcracker costumes and, strange designs that you would never see on stage anymore. But of course, we had to select them and bring them down. And we built a few new pieces as well. And, sometimes we could borrow from more recent ballets, and worked with a designer named Wanda Farian, who is one of the only costume designer in Winnipeg who does film and dance. So she was the perfect collaborator for that. And the entire team at the RWB, in the wardrobe department, I mean, what I learned on this show is that if you've got the wardrobe department of the ballet behind you, it's going to be smooth sailing, because really just months before the shooting begins, or even the choreography, you're in there doing fittings and sort of starting to conceptualize it all. And it was just an incredible team led by Elena Jarska.
Fantastic. You describe the film and the installation as walking through a ballet on all sides with layered screens of various translucents. Can you talk about that and describe what kind of an experience the patron is going to take in when they see the film?
Yeah, first they go through this very important and historical exhibit with so many chapters, and then really before the final exit, they come to our room. They have to walk through it in order to leave. And you're confronted with these projections of ballet dancers. They're larger than life, floor to ceiling. And, the Human Rights Museum has this incredible, vast, cathedral-like architecture. And you'll notice right away that the screen is covered by another screen that's in the middle of the room that's somewhat translucent, as you say, and it's a mesh screen. So images are projected on it, and through those images you can see another set of images behind. And for me, that was all about the hiddenness of the history and the way that this history is now only slowly starting to surface and be revealed. And so you know some of the story, but you don't know all of it. And I guess we just really wanted to have that sort of tactile feeling, because dance and sculpture, really, because I think this is a sculpture in some ways, is about the body and your body as a viewer, and then you're watching the bodies of the dancers. So I wanted there to be this kind of visceral, tactile quality to it all. so that you're really relating to the story you've just read about and learned in the exhibit, but on a physical level and more of an emotional level.
Mm-hmm. The subject matter, it's profoundly serious and intense. You have this idea in your mind of what you want ideally to have happen. How did you work with your choreographer, Freya Bjorg Olofsson? How did that collaboration work?
Well, we started, a year or, almost a year beforehand, just with meetings and sort of really mind melding, sharing books, clips, and that kind of thing. I was very familiar with Freya's work and her use of dance and video and technology. So I knew she was the only person that could do this piece. And then I guess as the person who wrote it, I started to define what those 7 movements would be, and also very much in conjunction with the museum who commissioned it. And, talking to this curator, Scott de Groot, about, what kind of aspects or avenues I thought might be useful to go into and depict in dance. And so we had a bit of back and forth there. And then Freya really created the choreography itself, like in the studio at the RWB with the dancers. We had a few weeks before filming. And she has a very intensive process where she discovers it, a lot of it through improvisation, through discussions with the dancers. She brought in a speaker to the dance studio to sort of really give them a grounding in the history as well. So, I guess we kind of yin-yanged it in a way. I was all about letting Freya just choreograph it. At first I thought I might be there all the time, but then I realized, no, you actually let her be alone with the dancers while they create it, and then when they're ready to show you something, you come back into the room. So it was a bit about letting go and letting the geniuses work on their own.
Yeah. Speaking of geniuses, I was sent the soundtrack to the film. It's incredible. It's composed by Andy Rudolph. Is this your first film that you've collaborated on with him? And did you give him any direction as to what you wanted in regards to music for the ballet?
He is a genius, and I'm lucky to say this is probably the 3rd or 4th thing we've done together, and I can't wait for us to do more. I can't wait for him to actually be able to compose something for a full live orchestra. The piece is very orchestral, and he used some live instruments, but I want to see Andy in a recording studio with the WSO, because his vision is so epic and vast in music, and also his use of the technology as well. He's electroacoustic in his background, so there's a lot of incredible sort of glitch sounds too. And in terms of direction and whatnot, we had conversations, and just like with Freya, there was some early mind melding going on. Sent him some imagery as soon as the edit started to begin, but really also it was about letting him just kind of go down to the basement in his house and just kind of come up with something on his own in his workshop. And then, towards the end of the process, I came in and it was, it was already there, and it was genius. I love the way he tapped into certain dancers and found sounds just for them. Like Stefan Azulay is part Argentinian in his heritage, and he's actually, I think, choreographing bolero. So when he dances, there's castanets and vibra slaps going and whatnot. And
there's the marching in the Milton Love the Feet as well.
And Andy actually drummed the that kind of snare drum. He said it was like the most intense drumming he's ever done. And he comes from a band that he's got the Catamounts, and Mahogany Frog is a great band too. So he's a really versatile musician, and he knows other musicians too. So he can get a live double bass player to come in and do some jazz tracks and whatnot. So it was very collaborative, and I guess it's great when you've worked with people more than once and you know each other's shorthand or even their emailing tendencies. Don't get mad when Andy says that. He's not really that mad.
The film and installation of The Regulation of Desire sounds fantastic. I'm going to wrap up the conversation by asking what you hope visitors will take away from the film and the exhibit, Love in a Dangerous Time.
Well, I hope that they'll learn about a very serious and very unfortunate piece of Canadian history, but through walking in the exhibit and spending a bit of time with it, to sort of be cleansed or smudged of the whole experience in a way, so that it transcends for them and goes to a different place, not so much of a a legal or bureaucratic place, but an emotional, poetic space where they leave the museum different than when they came in.
Fantastic. Noam, this has been so great to have you and have you here today. Thanks for taking the time to drop by and talk to me today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
For our Classic 107 listeners, the exhibit Love in a Dangerous Time and the film The Regulation of Desire is on right now at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. The exhibit runs until early 2026. Noam, thanks again.
Thanks.